Previously on agentpalmer.com, Mick Foley brings the heat with Scooter. Even in Lego form, the International Space Station is an engineering marvel, and I'm still thinking back fondly to my time behind the curtain, thanks to Alana. This is the Palmer Files, episode 44, with Ethan Gilsdorf, journalist, teacher, essayist, and author of Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks. We discuss his book, how gaming is important to who we are, being creatives, finding your place, and so much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 44th episode is Ethan Gilsdorf, whose book, Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, I recently reviewed and is a part of what we discussed. As much as I recommend that book, I will tell you that the conversation you're about to hear will not spoil that book, but it is a good taste. If you enjoy what you are about to hear, seek out his book. Perhaps you haven't read his book, as I did, but you may have read something else he wrote. He has had pieces in such publications as the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Wired, Salon, National Geographic. You get the idea. He's a journalist, memoirist, essayist, and teacher, as well as a geek, and all of those things made me want to talk to Ethan, because outside of his prolific career as a writer, we have a lot of things in common. What you are about to hear is a discussion by two geeks about what that means to us and our stories, plus what digital means to the RPG theater of the mind that we still enjoy, being a creative with a day job, leaving things up to chance, the new face of geekdom is everyone, and the moment when it all clicks, plus much more. Before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer or Ethan at Ethan Freak, that's ETHANFREAK, and this show at The Palmer Files. You can get all of Ethan's particulars, including where to buy his book and a look at his TED Talk, Why Dungeons & Dragons is Good for You in Real Life, at ethangilsdorf.com, that's ETHANGILSDORF.com. You can see my review of Ethan's book and all of my other writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. So without further ado, roll for initiative. Ethan, I'm going to start out with an unorthodox thing for my podcast. I'm not going to ask you a question. I want to thank you for being one of the leaders, but just by being slightly older than me, who kind of embraced the geek culture so that there was something for me when I got there. Because I'm years your junior, and you know, for me it was playing D&D at camp, and then, you know, playing Magic the Gathering at camp, and it was just, well, this is, wow, okay, I'm opened. This is the greatest. These are my hobbies now. And then I went, and it just so happened that after I found Magic the Gathering, a hobby store, a gaming store appeared in my town literally that summer after I came back from camp. And I worked there for 5 or 6 years just learning collectible card games and playing D&D. It was amazing, and I feel like I owe you something for having been there before me and having gone through, as I know now, all of the D&D is the devil stuff, and I just, like, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. That's a very generous and kind thing to say. Wouldn't have thought that I played that role, for anybody in particular, but it's kind of you to say so. And I think that as all of these geeky, nerdy pursuits, become more mainstream for a variety of reasons, which perhaps we'll talk about. I think that, what I'm realizing is there's so many so many people out there who've been touched by this stuff at one point in their lives. Your story sounds amazing. That's a story. Like, I came home from summer camp, and as if by magic, someone had conjured this gaming store in my neighborhood, as if you had willed it to happen. I mean, that's kind of an amazing. I don't know how old you were at the time, but like.
So I would have been 12, and it ended or 13. Something of that. And I became friends with the owner. It was my first job, although I think I got paid more in store credit than money. But I mean, I was a kid. That's where I was spending my money anyway. So probably the best job I've ever had. I mean, one of the perks was that I got to learn, or I saw it as a perk. There were other people that were employed there that didn't, but I got to learn how to play all of the games because somebody on staff had to teach anybody who might have been interested in a game. So I learned to play the short-lived Monty Python collectible card game, and Magic, of course, but Spellfire and Middle-earth, which was also short-lived, and the Star Wars game from 95 or 96. All these games, I just got to learn them. I don't remember any of it now. Right. But
wouldn't take much to fall back into that. What an incredible apprenticeship in a way.
It really is. And then I lost it. Like you fall out of love with it. I mean, it similar to the narrative in the beginning of your book where you're talking about like, well, then I went to college, right? And I look back because Magic's my main one. And I played a lot, and I went to tournaments, and I tried to, before there was, digital platforms and stuff, like we would drive around New England and the Mid-Atlantic going to Pro Tour qualifiers, and, then all of a sudden it was gone. And then I picked it up again, and then I didn't. And now I draft with some friends every couple sets. Now, again, I'm back into it. And it's so weird that, like, it was there and it wasn't. It was there. I don't know if it ever really leaves.
Right.
I mean, you started with D&D, and then towards the end of the book, you are getting back into D&D.
Right.
And that was a while ago. Are you back into D&D now?
Fully. Yeah, fully. I've been playing in a funny way. If I could rewrite the book today, because it has been, about 12 years since I wrote it, since it came out, I think that last chapter would be a little bit different because it ends in a somewhat ambivalent place. Sort of, I'll probably try this out. I'm not sure it's going to be something I would regularly do. But in fact, what did happen was, as a result of the book, I found myself sort of, in some ways wanting to be a more public entity, a sort of more public advocate for this game. And as a result, I started to play more regularly just because it was fun anyway. So I do have a group of mostly guys, sadly. Maybe that part hasn't changed, 55-year-old guys in my peer group who we play with. We play, every so often. The joke is that, when you grow older, you have more money for these gaming, all the toys that you need to play, but you have less time. And when you're a kid, it's the opposite, right? Unless, lucky you have a inside track and you have a job at a game store. But when you're a kid, it's the opposite. You can't get enough of the stuff, right? And you have to ask your parents to give you a ride to the mall, or you have to send a money order to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is where D&D was made. It was impossible to get the stuff, but you had tons of time. At least that was my memory. Summers, after school, weekends, so little responsibilities, so much. And then, of course, you mentioned you were 12. Like, I was 12 too when I got into D&D. It's the perfect year. It captured my imagination so clearly. And so, yeah, I have been playing quite regularly. I'm also playing in a group as the dungeon master for a high school group here in my town where I live, as a sort of after school club, as kind of their leader of the group. And that's been really interesting to play with young people.
Do you prefer, so I always, and this isn't necessarily for the podcast, but anytime I meet somebody who plays RPGs of any kind, I like to ask, do you prefer to be a player or, the one in control? Given the game, for D&D, it's Dungeon Master. Like, what do you have a preference?
I think I kind of like to be the game master as a general rule. I would say that, and if you've ever run a game before, you may know sort of the sort of routine here. But like, there's a lot of preparation and a lot of thinking, a lot of imagining. And in my case, I'm a sort of amateur artist, so I do some doodling and I make drawings of things that I'm trying to sort of get my creative spirit sort of harnessed to something that's somewhat tangible. And so I make a lot of drawings. I love to make maps, all that sort of stuff that in the end, one tiny percentage of that really makes it into the game. And of course, a lot of it changes when you're playing. But what I love about that is just that imaginative, creative space that, being the dungeon master, the referee of the game, the sort of world builder god, whatever, everything else that role entails is preferable. I mean, in some ways, I love playing too, of course, but I love the idea of kind of making up the stuff.
See, and I am the quintessential, like, let me roll a character. I just want to play. Like, I enjoy the problem solving as much as I enjoy like I mean, it sounds cliche, but like the team dynamic, right? Like, especially when, and there've been a couple games long ago that I played where we rolled for alignment because like, oh, that's so-and-so, you're going to be a wizard and you're going to be, chaotic neutral, so you can do whatever the heck you want. But there were a couple times we rolled for alignment and it was just like, well, I'm a nice guy, but my character is evil. So, sorry, but, and
right.
It's one of those things where I think all of those experiences, problem solving is universal. Like, and we don't all get enough experience in problem solving at a younger age. And I don't want to be so, not on the nose, but like so cliche that's like, well, there's a reason the geeks inherited the earth. Mm-hmm. Well, when everybody else was, I don't want to get too far. Like, the public school system is, these are the answers. Do this, funnel you through. And we're on Friday nights going like, well, I don't know how to get around this trap, but you got to figure it out. And so the problem solving, we're levels and miles ahead of everyone else. And it's so different than video games where it's structured and there's a physics to it, because you can make anything else up for D&D. And I love the imagination of the mind, the theater of the mind of it. And I recently got back into Pathfinder, because that's the group I'm around, but it had been a while, admittedly, since I had done any kind of role-playing games. And you fall right back into it. I feel like I'm playing characters from before. I haven't grown. Well, or my characters haven't grown.
Right.
I'm doing the same stuff I did a decade ago. Like,
right. And I think that's part of what's surprising to me is that I thought that I had outgrown it, or that I would be too, mature or too concerned about what people thought of me. And that was certainly a factor as to why I kind of was not part of the game for a very long time. Also, I just wasn't around it, but I really had, as I write about in my book, I really sort of made a conscious decision, semi-conscious decision. This isn't going to come with me into adulthood. I'm going to put this away. But what I've discovered in playing is that it isn't that hard to get back into that, as you said, that theater of the mind experience. And I love the idea that just for, not clear half an hour at a time, but maybe just a few moments in a game, all of us, just maybe at different times, sort of, you can tell that we're engaging with something that is not, not palpable. It's not real. It's not really what we're, the situation in the room, what we the wallpaper, the whatever, the pictures on the wall, like the real world really just does completely disappear. And I don't think that it's easy to recapture the experience of playing as a kid, because I think kids have this unique capacity, and particularly when you're first learning to play a game like Dungeons and Dragons, but you don't really know what the game is, and you're just trying to figure it out. There's just something incredibly powerful about being led into an experience, but you don't really understand what it is. If you have a good leader that can bring you into that experience. But in a way, I feel like I'm chasing that memory I had when I was 12 years old in 1979, like trying to like reconnect to that part of me. It can't, of course, really.
I will say, having like as you say those things, right? I think back to being in the store, 14, 15, and seeing like that first time player in any kind of, even like an introductory campaign, go like, tentatively, like they're so hesitant, like it's your turn. It's like, I'm gonna shoot it with my arrow, and they're like, it's a question more than an answer, and then they get a decent roll, and they're like, and it's dead, and really. Like, and there's always that moment, and maybe it's not the first time or the first encounter, but there's that moment in a game where it clicks. Maybe not like, oh, I can do anything I want, I just happen to have this weapon and I used it, but like, oh, I said a thing and it happened. Like that's
right.
that first moment, like there's this, like a little thing that clicks, right? And I think it's early on for everybody. When I was playing Magic competitively, I remember the first time I won at a quote unquote sleepaway tournament, right? Like we drove all this way. All right. Well, I've been playing in my store for so long. Like I know everybody. This is a stranger I'm sitting down next to. What now? But then when the game's over, you're on the same level. And I played with, people older than me, men, women, it's the great equalizer right now. And I think that as everybody starts to go like, well, I played that back in the day, or it levels the playing field a little bit. But, and I didn't want to go here like straight away, but like the digital is infringing upon all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of that existed when you were writing the book, but to a larger extent, I don't play that many video games. I just don't. Do you?
I don't even have the equipment. I mean, it's not something that particularly interests me. I actually like the experience of the music and the atmospheres, the sort of visual world building that a lot of these games have. And sometimes if I'm bored, I'll go onto YouTube and look at some actual play or whatever, Twitch, just to kind of get a flavor for what these games are like. But I was recently writing a story about esports, basically at the collegiate level, and hung out with some folks at a local college not too far from where I live, who are on the varsity esports team, and got my head back into that world. I mean, it'd been so long. And I, in particular, that team was an Overwatch team, which is not a game I'd ever, played before. And I tried to learn how to play, or at least tried to take it out for a spin. And I was so humiliated. And I realized that for so many reasons, it just would not be the kind of thing I would be good at, nor do I have the time or want to necessarily put the time in just to get good at, the practice stuff. It's the you fall down, you pick yourself up, you do it again, that sort of muscle memory stuff. That's never been the kind of gaming experience that's interested me in the same way, unlike D&D, which is, I mean, obviously there is a bit of that, but it's not this sort of hand-eye coordination stuff. It's not about that at all.
So I remember at the store, say 96, we put in 3 or 4 networked computers. And I mean, these were local network. This was LAN Party City, right? But it was just for in-store, it was something else, right? And it was Quake, it was Diablo, and it was Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness. Those were the 3 main things everybody played. And I'm going to borrow a term that I love from your book. I am now a video game grognard, basically, because I still go back and play those 3 games. Like, yes, first-person shooters have come a long way. Give me Quake, or maybe like Duke Nukem 3D from the same era. And Diablo is in its millionth incarnation, and WoW has taken off. Give me the original, like, Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness. Give me the original Diablo. I just go back to these original things, and I play them, and I pick them up, and I always make sure I have an old computer just so I can make them run. But I have no interest in Diablo 4, and I never got into WoW in any capacity. And I just keep going back. I don't know what I'm looking for. Although, I guess when I'm playing, I'm transported right back to the store, like to a certain extent. But
yeah, maybe a comforting or familiar experience. But also, at least from my own experience playing those games, because as I said before, I'm not particularly skilled at least those kinds of, first-person shooter or sort of the kinds of games where there's a lot decided in a combat situation where you have to do a lot of, frantic button smashing and making the right, doing the right combinations of things to make things happen. But that, those kinds of skills are the kinds of things that, I could manage maybe a joystick with one or two buttons, because my coming of age in video games was arcade games, basically. And the early console games like Atari, and we had this system called Intellivision, which was pretty terrible actually, but where there was a limited amount of things you could do, and obviously the graphics were very, very limited. But I love going to these classic arcades where you can play the coin-op games, and I'll go right to Galaga or Robotron or some of these games that I loved, and I can it doesn't take that long to
get back into it.
Get it back, like I can actually do pretty well in Galaga, for a time, or Joust or some of these other games that I just loved. It's very comforting. It's very comforting to go back to that and to be, it's a transporting experience, but it's also like this was something I was good at back then, and I'm still okay at it. And it kind of makes me feel like maybe I'm not haven't quite, whatever, given up. I can still compete at something.
Well, Galaga is the one box I would want physically full in my house, I think. But I wanted to ask you are a writer by trade, right? That's
correct, yeah.
And I mean, obviously I can make an easy path from D&D to writer. Like that's not a stretch at all, but was writer always in the cards for you? Or I shouldn't say writer, but was being a creative always in the cards for you?
I think so. I don't know that I had any clear sense for how I would make a living at it, or be able to find a way to, cobble together some kind of existence where mostly some creative, endeavor would form some core, part of my day-to-day life. And that's taken different forms over the different years. Now I'm into my sixth decade. But I feel like, what's interesting is that when I look back on the sort of archaeological evidence of stuff that I've kept, and this is something I write about in my book, I have this thing called the Blue Cooler, which is this, this box of my old Dungeons and Dragons stuff, which I had kind of forgot about and didn't rediscover until I was around 40. And in that box was all my D&D stuff, which included a lot of typical stuff you'd expect with the game, but lots of stuff written in longhand pencil in notebooks that are scenarios for games, but really I think they were efforts to write novels. I mean, they were sort of very, 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 primitive as it were, and pretty poorly executed. But there's other evidence. When I look back, I look at some high school papers, and I see, creative assignments that were like collections of poems that I'd written that were, again, all terrible. Projects I did in history class, I did a lot of movie making as a kid, right around the same time that I was actually, before I discovered Dungeons and Dragons. My mom gave me a Super 8 movie camera. Okay. So I was interested in movies, and I'd seen Star Wars just the year before, and I was very excited about making my own sort of spaceship movies and claymation monster movies and things like that. So all of that stuff was there. And so when you look back at that, it's not, as the older Ethan, as I look back at that, it's pretty clear that this was kind of baked into my existence pretty early on. But like, if you'd asked me when I was in college, how are you going to make a living at this, Ethan? I wouldn't have the slightest. Wouldn't have the slightest
but
idea.
what did you go to school? Like, did you go to school for communications, writing? Like, is that?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. It was. I went to a liberal arts college in Western Mass, this sort of experimental place called Hampshire College, and studied filmmaking, and eventually kind of got out of the nuts and bolts of filmmaking and became interested in creative writing, and studied poetry and tried to write poems and short stories. And then I did an MFA degree, a master's in fine arts in poetry, a couple years after I graduated from college, and thought that maybe my creative pursuit would be poetry. Like, I would have a day job. I'd be like Wallace Stevens, and I would walk to work and go to my insurance. Well, not in my case, an insurance firm, but something mundane.
Yep.
Yeah. A mundane 9-to-5 job. And then in the weekends and evenings, I would write my great American poems, and I would get these, prestigious awards, and I would have collections of poetry, and I'd get my poetry published in the New Yorker, and that didn't quite happen. I had some success in that realm, but success in poetry is like, it's like saying, I don't know, like success in woodworking or something. I don't know. That's not a good example, but unless you know about it, you don't know about it. It's not something that anybody is really aware of. There might be one or two poets that people could maybe name. So in any case, and then it was a series of day jobs, around books. And I had worked in a bookstore. I worked for a small college. And then I moved to France for 5 years and became a journalist, a freelance journalist. And that was kind of my way back into storytelling, because I started to write sort of travel stories about me going off on these adventures. And there I was, like Bilbo Baggins or whatever, all over again. And so that was my way back into sort of narrative storytelling and writing through journalism and essays, and then the book, and then D&D, and we kind of circled back to D&D again. But it's all sort of there, like you can see it retrospectively.
So I have a similar thing. I went to a liberal arts college, and I didn't, I just majored in communications. It was like, all right, like no, it's the one thing I think, go back and tell your past self, like, no, get a degree in something you can like concrete do, like communications. You can do anything you want. Okay. But then you get your degree and you go, I don't know. Right. Like, but for me, it ended up being podcasting, and it's only been in doing the podcast that I put the pieces together. Mm-hmm. I did soundboard and sound for behind the scenes of theater. When I went away to the summer camp where I found D&D, I did some radio stuff. I did some radio stuff in college. It was in a roundabout way, it was all there, but you don't usually, and I feel like this is a D&D thing as well, you don't necessarily see like that you were headed this quote unquote direction until you get there, and you're like, oh, that okay, now it makes sense. Like, and while this isn't paying the bills, like I'm not gonna stop doing it. Like I found a place, right? And first of all, I'm happy you found back to writing, because I did enjoy the book. And I feel like all of that stuff leads to the book, obviously. I mean, you're not just going to be like, had you gotten the mundane job, been like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to write a book. Like, I feel like we need to be put in scenarios where we get challenged or challenge ourselves. Obviously, when you got back into writing was, quote unquote, the great American novel, because it's what we all say. I'm guilty of it as well. Was there publishing a book a goal for you, even when you got back into writing?
Yeah, I think I wasn't sure what kind of book it was going to be. I think for many years, I thought it would be a novel or a fantasy novel. And then I thought it was going to be a collection of poems. At a certain point, I thought it would be some kind of memoir, because I really wanted to, the material that's in the front of the book, the first couple of chapters about particularly what happened to my mom and her brain aneurysm as a young woman when I was a young kid. That was a powerful experience, and I felt like that was something that, for my own purposes, psychologically, therapeutically, emotionally, psychically, felt important for me to be able to write and process. So that felt like the story I was going to write, and did try prior to writing Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, a version of a sort of a memoir, and I wasn't sure what the story would be, but had something to do with my life and my mother's life, and sort of trying to recapture or account for or preserve, in some way preserve her legacy. I didn't think it was going to be this book, but as it turned out, I was writing a lot about, I'm lucky in that because I've been writing mostly nonfiction, the stuff that I write about is often stuff that I'm curious about, stuff that I'm interested in. And as a journalist, you can be lucky if you can, be writing in a field or in a subject area that you enjoy, and obviously I wasn't going to be a sports reporter, although I was madly in love with the Boston Red Sox as a kid. And I remember getting the Boston Globe as a kid and reading the sports pages and reading the funnies, as we called them. And that was about as much as I read. But, that part was always struck me as something I could do. But I didn't study journalism in college. As I said, I studied filmmaking, which is fairly useless in some ways. But I think that, I think I smartly just decided that I wanted to write about something that felt like it meant something to me personally. I was curious about what this game had meant to me, but also it felt culturally sort of the moment. There was something happening. And then this goes back 10 or 12 years. There was something happening at that moment that felt like something was on the verge. We had Harry Potter, we had Lord of the Rings, we had World of Warcraft. All this stuff was kind of coalescing. And I felt like here's a chance for me to sort of weigh in on this, but not as a social critic really, or as a kind of psychologist. That's not my background. Just me, like what does this stuff mean to me, and what might it mean to other people? So I do have other sort of more pure memoir projects in the on the back burner that I've dipped my toes into from time to time. I don't think that the idea of writing fiction is really. I've tried in the interim to also write fiction. I don't think I'm very good at making up things. Strangely enough, in a plotted way, I feel like in an improvisational way, like you and I are doing here in a D&D game, I feel like I can randomly make up things. And it's funny you say the radio thing, because I was also a radio DJ for a while as well, just as a hobby, like a college DJ kind of thing. So that part's exciting to me. I've been incredibly fortunate, that I've been able to find a way to make some kind of living. Mostly I'm also teaching, right? I'm doing a lot of creative writing teaching, which is another way that writers make their money, right? They find a way to teach something. And a lot of creative pursuits are similar. You might be an art teacher, you might be a music teacher.
You talk about like something coalescing around the time that you're putting that book together, but a lot has happened in the 10 years on since, and I was trying to put myself back into it was released in 2009, so I'm presuming you wrote it over 07, 08, 09-ish. And I just kept going, well, Iron Man comes out in 2008, so you're not, in hindsight, sure, it's a cultural touchstone, but it's just hey, we finally got a comic book, like another comic book movie that's not Batman. You wouldn't have known it would spawn something bigger.
Right.
And then, obviously, that's a completely different kind of geekdom, but there's so much, like, that has kind of exploded. Twitch, obviously, which, I feel like, and this is wholeheartedly for me a harken back to RPGs of any kind. Twitch is your character got killed, but you don't want to leave. And I know, not everybody's playing those kind of games, but that's always what it feels to me like when I'm watching, because I have had characters die in campaigns. And you don't just pack up and leave. Like, you either re-roll a new character that they'll stumble across, or you just hang out. And to me, in a nutshell, that's Twitch. Like, okay,
that's interesting.
I've got my character, but I'm not going anywhere. But I wonder, oh, you know what? Before I go there, first of all, can I tell you that your TED Talk feels like an addendum to the book?
Yeah, that seems fair. I think that's a good way to look at it. And it feels like that's probably what I would say, if I could write a updated, revised edition or something like that. Because obviously so much has happened in the world of D&D since my book was published, which is pretty astounding when I really think about what the cultural imprint or the cultural sort of footprint it has now is beyond my wildest dreams.
I go back to Vin Diesel he's the touchstone for me of like, it's not just guys with glasses anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there were others, and in your TED Talk you have that slide of everybody, but for me this was after Fast and Furious had become a franchise, and I was just like, yay, like somebody who doesn't look like me, not just pasty with glasses. I'll bring the Mountain Dew, you bring the Doritos. Like,
yeah, that's been huge. I think that's been, I mean, it's hard to know whether, which came first, the celebrity who admitted to playing D&D, or was it someone else who encouraged the celebrity, to come out of the closet? But I feel like those larger cultural figures who have been willing to reveal that about themselves has been incredibly affirming for many people. And I think also the advent, as you mentioned, Twitch. I mean, I think the advent of live streaming of any kind of a real play game where people can see how it actually works, and it can be sort of good-looking people, and they can be voice actors, or they can be sort of, or not, but there's not much to the game, and it doesn't require, the sort of arcane, super nerdy research. You can just start playing with very, very limited experience, very limited rules. It kind of demystifies it, and I think that's been an important part of it. I think also people my age who are in Hollywood or in Silicon Valley, or people my age, between, let's say, your age and my age, who are now to a certain extent in control of producing content that we are all, absorbing. These people are a lot of them are being quite articulate about saying how the game was important to them as at a time in their lives, to help them through difficult things they were going through, or help them, as we were talking about earlier, learn about sort of creative problem solving or out of the box thinking, or, plot or story or character, all these things that, of course, are how to run a company, how to run a .com. I mean, what kind of training goes into being a dungeon master and running a campaign that isn't applicable to any number of managerial, pursuits, right?
You know what? That gives me so I have not told this story yet, and I'm so thankful I get to tell it to you. I had one of my previous jobs. I had a boss who was very much like a mother to me, but there was a point where, for better or worse, I was just not happy. And it, it was probably short-lived. It was probably a couple weeks or months, and I had just given up and decided that there was some politics with some coworkers, and I was just not having. It wasn't as easy as it had once been, and I was cleaning up my home office, and I found a D20, and I went, you know what? For tomorrow, all of my decisions are going to be based on a roll of the die. And I think it lasted till lunch, because my boss, the mother figure, was like, can you do this? And I was like, hold on a sec. Roll die. Yes, I can. Right? Like, not all of my coworkers got such favorable roles. And I just, it was such, like, I almost wish I could do that for everything. Just because it would be wonderful to put it all to chance. Like, I don't have to think anymore, or necessarily. It's just like, oh, can you do this? One moment. Roll. No, I can't. Like, it would. And look, I understand my coworkers did not like that at all, and that's why I got told to, put the dice away at lunch.
Right.
But for that morning, it was a little freeing.
Yeah. And that is a beautiful part of the game, which I think is so interesting, that it is both this expansive universe that has sort of no limits, unlike a video game, which does have limits. To a certain extent, you can only go as far as the programmers have produced that corner of the world, and yet it's bound by this very strange notion that there's a probability for anything happening, and you just have to sort of, the luck of the gods has to be with you. You get to add things to your role, which represent kind of your own sort of personal, experience, your own personal, skill. But it's always just random shit. You just don't know what chance. And you might, and if you roll 20, it happens. There's a sort of wonderful inside joke in a way, but a kind of it's hopeful. Anyone can succeed at doing something. And I can just picture you at your workplace. You devise a chart for like all these activities, and if I roll a higher than 12, then I will say that I will, whatever.
I had just made it a flip of the coin, basically.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
it was more
50-50.
like, it was a scale of 1 no, 20 yes, and then varying degrees until it got to like 10, and then it would, in the middle it would be like, well, who's asking?
Right.
Right. And so, I didn't think it through, obviously, because I feel like, and I told friends after the fact, and they were all like, "You did what?" Like, I feel like all of them, as good friends would have tried to talk me out of it had I been like, you know what, tomorrow I'm thinking about taking a dice to work, and just that's what I'm gonna do, and they're gonna be like, "Yeah, what now? No, don't do that." But I did it, and you know what? Yeah, it makes for a great story, but it also, I said no to a coworker, and it felt great. And you know what? In hindsight, it was the right thing to do. But I probably would have said yes if I didn't roll the die. Like, yeah, whatever.
Right.
Like, that's
right.
Okay, And I feel like that's part of the role-playing aspect of it, which is you get to experience things you wouldn't normally do. And for one morning...
Right.
I got to experience saying no to someone I would normally say yes to. And you know what? Wasn't a problem. Like nothing happened.
Right.
It was just the fact that, all of my coworkers like, he's in there rolling a dice every time you ask him a question. Like, all right, fair enough. But, to go back to where we started, I think gaming is important. And I bring up, D&D and the devil worshiping thing. But when I was playing Magic the Gathering, very early on, the school board was like, nah, this is the devil, or somebody was like, this is the devil's card game. And I remember, and this is one of those like I've been told the story, so I feel like I was there, but I know I absolutely was not, where I know my parents went to the school board meeting and defended it, being like, he's reading at a higher level. He knows words he wouldn't otherwise normally know. His math has improved. Like, yeah, it's still a card game. It's still all based on chance, but there are so many other things. And, I would have never been like, yeah, I'm playing Magic the Gathering for my vocabulary. Like, that's
right.
Who says that? But my parents noticed. So, I mean, there's part of it must be true.
Right.
And D&D is the same thing. Like, there are weapons and just the combat mechanics and just, well, what do you want to do? I throw rock. Like, we don't talk like that when we're in a campaign. And so you're building this, not only storytelling, but you're building your vocabulary and all of these things that are just, it's wonderful. Like,
yeah.
This is why gaming is important. But I think you have the job I want.
What would that be?
I think all of it, like the whole thing, like, the teaching, the writing, like it all, like I've been unemployed for way too long now. Let's go with way too long.
Yeah.
And it's been a lot of, what do I want to do now? And honestly, I don't know. Like, I want a job, but that's a cop-out, because I don't want to just, I don't want the mundane job. I want something else. But something creative is next to, something creative I feel like is unrealistic. Like, because I feel like even when you were telling your story, you ended up getting lucky. Like, you rolled the 20, man. Like, that's, you got, or at least a 19, and you had some, some buffs.
Right. Well, yes. I think I've been fortunate. I think the downside for all the listeners out there, the downside is that most creative people I know have to tolerate a certain level of job insecurity. And I don't exactly have, there are some that I know who have full-time jobs. There are others who they might be writers. And so they can sell a book every few years and that kind of keeps them going. But in between those places where they have, where they don't have a contract or they don't have, a book advance, they have to find something to do. And I haven't had a real 9-to-5 job in the longest time, and it's probably been since 1999. So it's been 20 plus years, 23 years, 22 years. And I think in many ways, I'm incredibly fortunate and lucky. But the downside is, I don't have a retirement figured out, in my 50s, I'm paying for my own health insurance. My wife and I, sort of lament this continually. And she's a freelancer as well in a different field. So, it's becoming more attractive, this notion that you just sort of find something that's safe and stable, that's going to have that weekly paycheck and benefits.
So I have two questions. One, but isn't this your retirement? Like I to a certain extent, I mean, obviously you don't want to have to worry about the next paycheck, but I mean, you're a writer, and you're a teacher. And I feel like if I gave you $1 million, you would still be a writer and a teacher tomorrow.
True. Yeah.
Which is why, I've said on this podcast before, do I want to be a blogger and a podcaster for the rest of my life? Yeah, I do. Do I want it to be my full-time job? I don't know. There's a different level of pressure, I feel like, that you have to put on yourself if that's your main source of income. But, hi, I'm Jason. I'm a creative. I feel like that's a thing. We could create a support group for us, because I don't want to say it goes back to gaming, because I don't know if it necessarily does. I think that pigeonholes it too much. But as a creative, as a writer, as someone who wants to produce things, like, we're all dreamers.
Right. Yeah.
But the second thing, and this is a question for you directly from the book, really, is your wife a fellow geek? Because you talk, not to get like too in the book, but you talk about one of my favorite movies, Diner, and potentially creating a quiz, a geek quiz, not a Baltimore Colts quiz, but like a geek quiz for your significant other. And I have joked with my parents that is a thing I would absolutely love to do. And it was before I had read your book. This has been like an ongoing thing for my parents. And I actually have a partner who could pass that. This is probably the first partner I've ever had who could pass whatever geek quiz I throw at her.
Right.
But like, did you go through with that? Is that a thing?
I didn't really.
Okay.
In the end, although my wife is very tolerant of my interests, and she shares some of it, but not to the level that I do. I know that she had read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and she can converse in some of the stuff, but it's not something that she has her own. She has her own version, I would say, of this, but it's in a different field, and probably not something that people would consider to be sort of traditionally nerdy or geeky. But she's a designer, and she's really interested in graphic design and typefaces and interior decorating and that kind of stuff. It's not the same kind of level of geekdom, but I feel like part of what I hope the lesson of the book is, and certainly what I think everyone is observing in our culture, is that whatever this thing is that you're really passionate about is just as good and just as sort of valid and just as worthy as anyone else's thing that they're really into, whatever it is. Even if this group of activities, which are games, which are dress up, which are make believe, have always sort of been shunted to the side here. That's for kids, or that's for, people who can't handle the real world, or whatever those sort of pejorative, things are thrown at those kinds of activities. But there's always this level of sort of super detailed arcane knowledge and sort of inside information and sort of obsessive, attention to detail, all that sort of stuff that, and passion. I think that's the main thing. But yeah, short answer to your question, I'm giving you a bad long answer, is it basically no. I didn't exactly do the Diner quiz. But she did agree to play D&D with me once, which was lovely. And she, she will do other sort of, certainly indulge me in certain activities, but not like she's going to join my Thursday night D&D group,
No. And you know what? I think so I've learned, and my partner Stephanie has kind of, I won't be able to do a quiz either because I couldn't pass hers.
Right.
Like, I mean, we have overlapping geekdoms and nerddoms and whatever, right? But, I'm not the biggest Doctor Who fan. So
Right.
I have nothing for her there. I was Star
Right.
Wars. She was Star Wars and Star Trek. So I've got nothing for Trek. Like, and
Right.
I'm open to experiencing these fandoms. I'm not like, I'm not hardline like one or the other. It's just, I know that with time we will experience these things together, and that's fine. But any quiz I could give her that would be rough, that she'd have to study for, like, then I'd have to get hers. And it's like, I don't, that seems like a lot of work. And relationships aren't easy to begin with. And I'm talking like just friendships, right?
Sure.
So I don't want to, there's no point in adding another layer on top of it.
Right.
She plays in our Pathfinder with us. In fact, the first part of the campaign, she was the DM for, so it was wonderful. And
Yeah.
now the friend who was my kind of cohort is now in charge, and she's more player with me now. And again, it's because I have no interest in it, and I'm just, give me my character. I love this part. I'm a gnome with a longbow. Like, it just, I ended up rolling for that. I'm a rogue gnome that can, handle a longbow. It's the craziest thing I've ever played in all of my role playing, and it's wonderful. But I come back to it. I mean, I feel like, we've circled it kind of a few times, but like, we always end up coming back to this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's necessarily because of where we started, because not everybody started at 12 with D&D. I know people that started earlier and later that still absolutely love it. But I like the open worldness. I was always the guy who, if you gave me a game, I'd go to the edge.
Yeah.
And I know No Man's Sky and all these other games came out that, like, no, there's no edge. But really, like,
yeah,
I'm going to go to the edge. That's
right.
That's it. And in an open world like D&D, you don't have to worry about that. Well, I mean, you don't want to outsmart your leader,
right?
Your storyteller. Respect the DM. Like, seriously.
But a good game master will find a way to, indulge their players in the thing that they want to do, and work them into it. I feel like that's one of the things that I've noticed in my own play style, where I was, as a teenager, I was very obsessed with rules, and sort of everybody playing the right way, and there was lots of thumbing through the Dungeon Master's Guide to argue with each other about certain, rules that each of us felt very strongly about. The only way to play this, the only answer to this question was, yes, no, on, off, black, white. But today it is more the open, to me, the open world, as you talked about earlier, the theater of the mind, this sort of imaginative space. I'm pretty skeptical of the modern world in some ways. I feel very tenuously connected to it in many ways, and I find myself just on a daily basis, sort of, I go for walks and just think about what would life be like if, if there weren't cars here and there weren't, strip malls, just sort of this place that I go to in my head that is admittedly a fantasy, but there's something about what I'm doing there that feels really important. I don't know, maybe it is going there to recharge or to sort of take a little rest. But I'm very, in some ways, very disappointed with in some ways, how the modern life is. It's sort of boring, and sort of drab on some level.
So it reminds me of, I'm gonna try and get this quote right from your book. Not that I want to quote you to you, but when you talk about escapism and fantasy and the need for imagination and escape, you and this was obviously written a while ago, but you said something like, the real world is a mostly known, I think it is mostly known and scary quantity, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I I don't know if it's feather in your cap, but you were right. Like, then you were right. Now you're right. Like, you like that statement is just generally, it can go up there with, gravity, laws of gravity. Like, it's just, we know what it is, and it's scary.
Right. Particularly given what's happened this last year, or even depending on your political views, just the sort of state of our country, the upheaval, the sort of pessimism, the sort of sense that we're not making progress in some ways, then obviously the pandemic. The world is a scary place. It can be a scary place, and it's not. No wonder that D&D and sort of serialized television, on Netflix or HBO Max or Hulu or whatever, wherever you watch it, is so incredibly popular, but sort of needed in a way.
Well, and you know what? I go back to our younger selves, because I admittedly ran cross country, but that's like being a geek in sport. Okay,
for sure.
Like,
right.
I was also in the band. My father points at me when we watch Revenge of the Nerds together, and anybody who's ever feel oppressed, and the whole band gets up, right? Like, so I know that of our younger selves, the world was a scary place. Like, if maybe now as adults, it's a different kind of scary. But for those of us that didn't go out on Friday night, we were staying in, or we were going out to a friend's house to stay in, the world was scary then. Like, the degree to which it is scary has changed. But that fact has remained constant. And I feel that while we are better prepared, I think, than some, it doesn't make it any less scary. In fact, what happens is we grew up, we got more knowledge, and realized it's even scarier.
Right. More places for our worries and our neuroses and whatever that would be. You're absolutely right. I think that, I remember as a kid, I was terrified of growing up and being an adult, partly because of my experience of it was a little bit different from other people, given what had happened to my mom. But even before my mom got sick, I think it was just something I couldn't fathom about being an adult and having to get a job and money and insurance, all this stuff, getting a driver's license. It all just seemed too much. And I, despite my fears, I'd managed to conquer a lot of that. And I am, making money, and I have to file my taxes and, basically, functioning. But it is surprising how at times those fears don't go away. And it's not that hard for me to remember that I'm just an older version of the younger Ethan who was, found the real world a really challenging place, for so many reasons. And here we are, 2021.
Yeah, it's I hate the more things change, the more they stay the same. But like, I'm still that scared kid. Like, I don't know if I will. I have anxiety now, and I've been living it for a while. Probably, actually, I've probably been living with it for approximately as long as your book's been in print.
Right.
And somewhere around there, or maybe longer. I didn't have that when I was a kid, but I was still scared. Like, and I think this is, thanks to D&D, I know I can overcome it, right? Like, I've overcome things I wouldn't normally be able to. So a little anxiety. All right, well, I'm still going to go outside today, right? Or,
right.
I'm going to take the shot. Instead of hiding behind my shield, I'm going to take the shot, right? Like,
right.
Because you don't know. And, part of that is right brain, left brain, growing up, not growing up, whatever. But I have seen miracles happen, right? They might have been, again, in the theater of the mind that we keep going back to, but I've seen them. So I know they exist. I've seen the guy make the saving throw.
Right.
That doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
Some people actually die. Like,
right.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
If I don't roll the die,
You'll never know.
I'll never know. Yeah.
Right. No, that's very true. That's very true. I think inside all of us is that version of ourselves that, maybe we're trying to protect or trying to be gentle with and have compassion towards. And I struggle with that all the time as an adult. How much of me is the man and how much of me is the scared kid still trying to find voice or trying to be protected and yet, as you were saying with the game, I mean, that's one of the beautiful things of the game. And maybe this isn't unique to D&D. Maybe it's any kind of storytelling experience, but this notion that it's a kind of role playing, even when you're reading a book, you're empathizing with someone else's experience. Maybe you're trying something out that you wouldn't normally do in real life. I talk about this in my creative writing classes all the time, the importance of personal narrative and how just the idea that we're reading so we don't feel so alone. We're not the only person who's been through this thing. That gives us courage. That gives us some sense that we may, survive whatever we're going through, or someone else has survived it. And maybe I can find how did they deal with that? How did they process that? How did they recover from this loss? How did they, grieve? How did they, pick themselves up off the ground? I mean, and that's what's so great about D&D, or whether it's about, to my mind, what feels like an explosion of storytelling, whether it's in podcasts, whether it's, all the self-publishing that's happening. And you can argue about quality, and you can argue about who the gatekeepers and sort of who should be allowed, to produce content and who shouldn't. But in the end, it's this impulse just to share the human experience, and it's all valuable. It's all, people just trying to figure their shit out and get it, into some form that hopefully will have be useful to someone else. And whether that's a fantasy story or whether that's a real story, it doesn't ultimately matter that much. How you tell your own story, what kind of character do you want to be in the story of your life? Are you going to be a victim? Are you going to be a hero? Are you going to be the comeback kid? Are you going to be, resurrected? There's all kinds of metaphors.
Yeah.
You talk about.
And I've been reading a lot, prolifically actually, for probably the most I've ever read in my life for the last 5 or 6 years. And I have started to read things I wouldn't normally read. And I every other book I read seems to be biography these days, just because I want people's stories. And I prefer autobiography because while I know there's some embellishment, I'm okay with it. I want your story. Mm-hmm. But I've also been doing the whole, well, this book mentioned another book, so I'm going to go get it. And because of you, actually, I picked up the Nerds book that you mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
And I haven't cracked it open yet, but I'm excited to, because I'm like, well, let's find out. And now, maybe 20 years ago, I would have just read your book and that would be that. But I'm trying to broaden myself. Like, how else am I going to get books recommended to me? Like, you like what you like. So-and-so likes what they like. So it was mentioned in your book and I enjoyed your book. So I'm picking up this other thing, right? And I've kind of been doing that for the better part of the last few years, and I've read things I wouldn't have normally. So it's like I've at least leveled that part of myself up.
Right. That's good. I think that following your nose there is a good instinct.
As Ethan and I discussed, the world is a scary place and fairly unknown. And I don't want to harp on that too much, but there is exponentially more that we don't know than we do. And that of itself doesn't inherently make the world scary, but it doesn't help either, which is why we need art, entertainment, and games for escape. And most commonly, when we escape, we go back to the things that comfort us. Thus, we go back to our comfort zone. The music you always go back to, the movies and television shows you always go back to, and yes, the games you always go back to. That circular nature is a part of who we are. It's the very reason that we have the concept of comfort movies and comfort albums, because they mean something to us and we go back to them when we need comfort, especially when the world is a scary place, and more to the point, especially when being overwhelmed doesn't just seem to go away because you get older, which again brings me back to escapism. Lots of things are circular. Our games, our hobbies, even our skills. The more I talk to people, especially in the creative fields, but certainly not limited to them, the more I believe that we all end up where we're supposed to be. But, and this is certainly related to my tabletop role-playing experiences, you only know you belong once you arrive. And if you don't know or feel that sense of belonging, then you just haven't arrived yet. It may be an oversimplistic explanation, or even a bit saccharine, but as I am still in the process of heading to where I belong, I know what's missing. I'm just not sure where it is. Again, we're back to the unknowns of the world that we can all be skeptical of, and again, that brings us back to the reason and need for escape. So, before I get stuck in a loop, are you where you belong? If you are, congratulations. If you aren't, are you making strides to end up there? And if you aren't, why not? Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 44. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest, Ethan, at Ethan Freak, that's ETHANFREAK, and this show at the Palmer Files. You can get all of Ethan's particulars, including where to buy his book and a look at his TED Talk, at ethangilsdorf.com. That's ETHANGILSDORF.com. You can see my review of Ethan's book, Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, plus all of my other writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. One final question for me.
Well, actually, this does follow up on one of the things we were saying earlier. I mean, you were mulling over what you could do. You know, if you could either have the perfect job, or maybe you have, in a fantasy world, sort of unlimited resources and money's not an issue. What would be your dream? You know, going forward 5 years from now or 10 years from now, would you want to be a syndicated talk show host, or a podcast, creator host who has, millions of listeners and could make your living that way? Or is there some other creative pursuit? You mentioned creatives. Is there some other creative pursuit that you could do if you just, without any connection to reality, like if it just could happen?
So I know I would continue the podcast and the blog because I enjoy the writing and I enjoy the recording and I enjoy the editing, and I even don't mind, like I just reached out to you, like I had, I'm not afraid of that. In fact, that's a thing I've gotten over, like nobody's going to want to do my show, but you got to ask, like, otherwise, I don't want to be syndicated. I almost feel like I only want to be successful enough. And I know it sounds like slightly counterintuitive. I would be happy to cap my listenership at like 50,000, 100,000, and not 1 million. I would rather a small dedicated fan base. But the only thing that I would do differently than what I'm doing now is I would get an assistant or some fans or someone to point out smaller podcasts or smaller bloggers that I could then guest on. Because the one thing that drives me nuts about both blogging and podcasting is that there's not necessarily gatekeepers, right? But someone like me who does it because I enjoy it, getting the eye of, or the ear of, or the, whatever of the next rung up the ladder of people who get, more downloads than me, or are moderately successful, as opposed to like, your Mark Marons or your Kevin Smiths, right? Like the people in between us that are closer to me are always so looking forward or doing their own thing. They don't look back down to where they were. And I just want to make sure that, maybe this is why I said you had the perfect job for me. Like, I don't necessarily want to teach, but if I can take my moderately successful podcast of 75,000, for my audience, and go back down to somebody who gets like 50 downloads and be on their show and bring my audience, that I want to do that because it's the one thing that I cannot find people doing for me. So I go, there's a void. I want to do that for other people. And I would need, an assistant, or I'd need my listeners to be like, hey, there's this other show I really like that's really small. Would you do it? Like, yeah, like I would. But I'm trying to jump up right now. And I just know that, I've written it down several times so I don't forget. But like whenever I get there, whenever I get to whatever level that happens to be for me, I just want to turn it around and help the people behind me. Because it always seems like everybody wants to go like I start a podcast or I start a blog, if I can't sell it, if I can't, get to millions of downloads, I'm out, right? And there's people that just do it passionately that are of moderate success or that are of no success at all. They've got their core 10 listeners. I want to help them. I just want to give them a platform, whether it's guesting on my show or having me on theirs. Like, I want to turn around and help those people. And it's the one thing I would do differently. Otherwise, I would just keep writing and reading and talking to people, I guess.
Which is not a bad way to live. I mean, that's what's wonderful about both what you do and what I do. I feel like is you get to interact with people we wouldn't normally interact with on a daily basis, or for me in the course of teaching, just get some random people in the room together. In your case, reach out to someone, have them on your show, and just have conversations. So important, especially now. Everyone's locked at home,
It's so weird, but I feel like conversations are just hard. Like it's a I know it's oversaid, like conversations are a dying art, but I feel like they are. Because there are like three types of people that I've found. There's the people that are okay with the awkward silence because, they're thinking of something better to say, or they're just thinking. There's the people that have to fill the silence. And then there's the people that just couldn't be bothered.
Right.
Why would I talk to that guy? Like, what?
Right.
Like, no, I mean, you should be comfortable with an awkward silence every once in a while. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And you should be able to talk to anybody. And, that's just the way it works. I still get nervous. I had my friends on this show and got nervous when they were on. So as long as I have those nerves, I'm cool. Like, I feel like that reminds me, like, oh, this still matters. Okay.
Right. Well, there's an art to it. As you said, there's an art, and, people aren't certainly sitting down for an hour or an hour and a half as we have. It's not something people really have the training or time to do. And I don't know if it's going to be a generational thing or whether it's our perpetual, the way in which technology has made it so much easier to become distracted and to sort of make it acceptable not to be fully tuned in to someone else. It's so easy to, as you said, during that awkward silence, it's just like, well, I better check my phone then, just in that 5-second interval. It's like, well, I'm not engaging you, so now I can go do something else. It's really hard to resist that.
Yeah.
Because of these stupid devices that we all have in our back pockets. So